If you woke up one morning, stepped into the central square, and saw dozens of people dancing frantically, not to music, not for a festival, but driven by an invisible force that wouldn't let them stop, how would you react? Would you laugh, thinking it was a farce? Or would you shudder as you realized the smiles on their lips had twisted into agony? In the summer of 1518 in Strasbourg, a city within the Holy Roman Empire, a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped into the street and began to dance. There was no music, no encouraging crowd, yet she continued day after day. Then, like an invisible contagion, dozens and then hundreds of others were pulled into this deathly dance. Unable to stop, they danced until exhaustion, even collapsing and dying. Witnesses at the time did not know what to believe: God's punishment, demonic possession, or a strange disease. History calls it by a haunting name, the dancing plague. And the most terrifying part was not the relentless stomping of feet on the stone, but the fact that no one understood why an entire community had fallen into a state of mass hysteria. So what really happened in Strasbourg in 1518? Today, we will step into one of humanity's most chilling mysteries, a place where dance brought not joy but only sowed death. In 1518, Strasbourg was a bustling city on the banks of the Rhine River, under the authority of the Holy Roman Empire. But beneath that wealthy veneer was a society fracturing from famine, disease, and religious fear that besieged every home. That summer, oppressive heat blanketed the city, food was scarce, and the plague had just swept through, leaving the populace living in constant dread of death. Amidst that gloomy atmosphere, the Church preached that all calamities were God's punishment. The people of Strasbourg lived daily in anxiety, believing that humanity's sins would soon bring disaster. That invisible fear spread like a phantom, creeping into every alley, every square. Notably, the city was then immersed in the severity of religious laws and superstitious customs. People believed in healing through pilgrimage, in the power of exorcism, and in patron saints who could save their souls. It was in this suffocating landscape that any strange event could easily be exaggerated into a supernatural omen. Imagine a place where just one strange illness would make the entire community immediately think of divine retribution. In that context, when Frau Trophäa began her bizarre dance, people didn't see an exhausted woman, but rather an emissary bearing a message from the underworld. And then, instead of being extinguished, that fear ignited the flames of madness. The witnessing crowd became suggestible. One by one, they fell into the terrifying spiral. It was this mixture of spiritual crisis, social pressure, and religious fear that turned Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 into a giant pressure cooker, just waiting to explode. And when it erupted, people could no longer tell what was real and what was illusion, only frenzied bodies trampling the ground in a rhythm that led to death. Everything began in July 1518, when a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped onto the cobblestone streets of Strasbourg. No music, no festival, no drums. She just danced. At first, passers-by stopped to watch curiously. Some mocked, thinking it was an absurd prank. But the laughter faded when they realized Frau Trophäa could not stop. She danced for hours on end, her body soaked in sweat, her eyes vacant, her feet bleeding. The next day, she continued. The third day, without rest, without food or drink, her body trembled, but was still controlled by an invisible force. And then, something terrible happened. Others began to join. One person, then two, then dozens, as if hypnotized, joined that insane rhythm. Within just 1 week, more than 30 people were swept into the dance. They did not laugh, they were not joyful, rather they convulsed, screaming and crying in despair. Records describe many collapsing, their feet broken open, blood staining the stones. But when they revived, they continued dancing, like puppets pulled by the strings of a ghostly force. The news spread throughout Strasbourg. The central square transformed into a theater of death. Hundreds of citizens gathered to witness, both terrified and unable to look away. The relentless sound of feet echoed through the night, mixed with cries, moans, and even prayers. Some witnesses believed they saw demonic shadows lurking around the crowd. Others insisted this was punishment from Saint Vitus, the saint often associated with convulsions and dancing. From then on, the name Saint Vitus's curse became attached to this event. Local authorities were completely baffled. They called in physicians, hoping to find the cause, but instead of advising rest, the physicians believed the dance had to be purged like an illness. So, they even built stages, hired musicians, and invited professional dancers to help those afflicted with the dancing plague continue dancing until the sickness left their bodies. A terrible mistake. The result was that the number of victims did not decrease, but skyrocketed. After just a few weeks, 400 people had been swept into the frenzy. Many dropped dead right in the square from exhaustion, stroke, or heart failure. The corpses were dragged away in the darkness, but the next morning, those remaining continued to dance, as if they hadn't seen death right before their eyes. Records recount haunting scenes, mothers abandoning their small children, elderly men trembling, even children diving into the dance. Some tried to cry for help, but no words came from their mouths, only their bodies writhing to the invisible rhythm. Amidst the chaos, priests intervened. They asserted this was the punishment of Saint Vitus. A pilgrimage was organized, leading the victims to the shrine dedicated to this saint. They were bound in special shoes, carved with crosses, and holy water was sprinkled on their bodies, hoping the curse would be lifted. Some people actually stopped after undergoing the ritual, but many others did not. The most terrifying thing was that no one knew the real cause. Was it a form of mass psychogenic disorder, exploding due to famine and stress? Or had the victims eaten rye contaminated with ergot fungus, a mold that creates a hallucinogenic substance similar to LSD? Or simply, was this a socio-psychological phenomenon where religious belief and the fear of death turned an entire community into puppets? Whatever the reason, Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 had transformed into a giant prison where people were incarcerated not by chains, but by their own bodies. That invisible dance claimed countless lives, leaving behind a haunting memory that lasted for centuries. And although historians today still debate the cause, one fact is undeniable. In Strasbourg, people once danced themselves to death. The nightmare in Strasbourg did not end with the bodies collapsing in the square. It left a deep wound in the city's collective memory. Hundreds of families mourned, cries mixed with the music of prayer services, and fear gripped the city to the point that many dared not go out after sunset. Merchants who once crowded the routes now hesitated. Trade stagnated. The church exploited the tragedy to consolidate its power. They declared this was evidence of Saint Vitus's wrath, and only pilgrimage rituals and offerings could resolve it. Streams of people flocked to the church, carrying the faint hope that they themselves would not become the next victim. However, not everyone believed the religious explanation. Some physicians began to propose medical hypotheses. Perhaps the people had eaten grain contaminated with ergot fungus, a mold producing a hallucinogenic substance that caused people to fall into a state of mania. Another theory suggested this was the result of a mass psychogenic illness, where fear, pressure, and overlapping religious beliefs had turned the entire community into puppets in a shared nightmare. But the most frightening thing was not the mystery of the cause, but the social division. Those who believed in God claimed this was punishment for human sin. Others blamed the authorities, arguing that the measure to make them dance more to be released had killed victims en masse. Still others whispered that demons were truly present in Strasbourg. These arguments caused the city to fall into a state of collective paranoia. People began to look at each other with suspicion, fearing the deathly dance could be transmitted at any moment. Many families forbade their children from going out. Taverns and markets fell silent. Festivals were canceled. Strasbourg, once a bustling city, suddenly turned into a giant tomb where the ghost of the dancing plague hovered over every roof. And then, like a storm that arrives quickly and quickly retreats, the dancing gradually subsided toward the end of summer. No one knew why. Perhaps the pilgrimage rituals had caused some to stop, or simply that the human body could no longer endure it. But the consequences were deeply ingrained. Dozens of lives were stolen. Hundreds were wounded, both physically and mentally. In the following years, the memory of the death dance continued to make all of Europe shudder. Other regions had recorded instances of mass dancing, but nowhere reached the level of madness seen in Strasbourg in 1518. This event became a symbol of collective fear, where humans, when suppressed by hunger, disease, and blind faith, can turn themselves into a disaster. And to this day, historians still debate, was this just a mass psychological epidemic? Or was there truly some invisible force that compelled people to dance until they died? Strasbourg never found the answer, and perhaps never wanted to face it again. Today, when we speak of pandemics, we often think of viruses, bacteria, cold statistics. But Strasbourg in 1518 showed something horrifying. There are epidemics that require no pathogen. Fear, blind faith, and social pressure are enough to pull an entire community toward death. In the modern world, we still see similar phenomena. Mass panics in schools, social suggestion incidents causing hundreds of people to collapse simultaneously, or even the spread of fake news, sowing fear and pushing crowds into chaos. Strasbourg. 1518 is not the distant past. It is a warning that still echoes today. Just imagine, if one day, in the middle of a crowded city, hundreds of people began acting as if hypnotized, would we have enough rationality to stand outside that vortex, or would we be swept along? The dancing plague ended more than 500 years ago, but the mystery surrounding it has never been fully solved. And it is that ambiguity that makes the story still haunting. Is the line between reason and madness thinner than we think? What about you? If you lived in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, would you believe this was a saint's curse, an illness, or proof of the fragility of the human mind? Share your thoughts. And if you found this story compelling, don't forget to leave a comment, like, and subscribe, because there are many more historical mysteries waiting to be decoded.